It is a story of myths and legends, a David and Goliath tale, a tale of brave, isolated England, defended by stout-hearted English seadogs like Drake, Hawkins and Frobisher. This small band of sailors protected Protestant England from the huge, sinister and overpowering force of King Philip's Spanish Armada. By the grace of God, the swiftness of our ships, the power of our guns, and the Protestant wind, the Spanish Armada was defeated and left to limp home. And above all the blood, the storms, and the roar of cannon is Queen Elizabeth I, good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana herself. The Tudor history handed down over the centuries has shown Elizabeth to have led the country throughout this moment of ultimate peril. She led, she cared, she did everything in her power to help her countrymen defeat the Spanish. She even appeared before her makeshift army at Tilbury and gave an inspiring speech at the moment when the campaign hung in the balance. A speech which put fire into the hearts of her soldiers and has resounded through history as one of the greatest speeches of all times. But what actually happened barely reflects what I've just said. Tudor propaganda has hidden Elizabeth's role in the Armada campaign. She dithered, she hid away, she refused to help when the call came, and when the danger was over, she turned her back on the men who had saved her. Don't believe me? Let's take a look. For years before the Armada of 1588, Elizabeth had been extremely tight with money, and had put money from piratical activities into her dresses, jewellery, and her court. The exchequer was not empty, but it was not healthy. Her army was non-existent, and her navy, small yet containing modern ships with state-of-the-art cannon, was poorly supplied with gunpowder and shot. This would be a large factor in why the English would not be able to land a killer blow on the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth did understand the importance of a strong navy. Indeed, when Philip II of Spain had been husband to Elizabeth's sister, Mary I, he had observed, "The kingdom of England is and must always remain strong at sea, since upon this the safety of the realm depends." Elizabeth gambled that her navy, reinforced by hired armed merchantmen and volunteer ships, driven by a desire to remain free from the Catholic yoke, could destroy an invasion force at sea. Her warships, the ones she paid for, were the walls of her realm, and were the first, and as we shall see, the last line of defence. Years of poor upkeep and no maintenance had rendered most of England's land defences almost pretty much pointless when set against the Spanish, the finest fighting force in the world at the time. In March 1587, the year before the Armada, the counties along the English Channel just had 6 cannon each. England had no standing army of fully armed and trained soldiers, other than small garrisons in Berwick on the Scottish borders, and in Dover Castle on the Channel coast. Her armed forces were made up of local militias, the trained bands. The county of Hampshire eventually raised 9,000 men, but many were very poorly furnished, some lacking a headpiece or helmet, some a sword, some one thing or other that is evil, unfit, or unseemly about him. Discipline was also problematic. The commander of the 3,000-strong Dorset militia firmly believed that they would sooner kill one another than annoy the enemy. When the Armada eventually cleared Cornwall, some of the Cornish militia, ordered to reinforce neighbouring counties, thought they had done more than enough to serve Queen and country. Their minds were on the harvest, and these reluctant soldiers decided to slink away from their commanders, their Queen, and their colours. The Northern Shires reported they only had 1 pound of gunpowder for a fortnight's training. It turns out they were only able to prime their muskets during training. In Northumberland, trained band officials and officers didn't even reply to royal correspondence. In Essex, the trained band once took 6 days to become even partially operational. In Suffolk, 5 days. A report at the time stated of one trained band, "By the time the arms be all viewed, it draws towards dinner time, and indeed officers love their bellies so much that they are loath to take too many pains. They worship not Mars, the god of war, but Bacchus, the god of wine." The trained bands could get so bad that they began harming and killing themselves. At Basing House, the Westminster Auxiliaries were so rusty at drill that their rear ranks shot down their front ranks. Since the introduction of the train band concept in 1573, the general muster of the country's most substantial and honest men between the ages of 16 and 60 were to meet and train regularly. These musters were to be led by local captains who were tasked to produce strong, lusty, able men fit for the wars. These captains were mainly men who had gained experience fighting in the Low Countries. The government calculated that they needed 200 of these men to train the country's train bands. However, many disqualified themselves and their comrades due to their Catholicism or lacking the qualities of sobriety and steadiness of temperament. These fit and able men surely turned out, but it is also documented that with them came the destitute and simple-minded, some bearing archaic weapons, many nothing at all. This training, perhaps 10 days a year, was supposedly to ensure that men could stand in the line of battle when needed, sometimes only constituted first aid to marksmanship and second to drill. These periods of training were to prove too short, too infrequent, and certainly struggled to keep pace with military technology and tactics. Thankfully for England, these men were mainly tasked to man signal beacons upon hills, cliff tops, and those that disfigured fine lines of church towers and steeples. This brief, inadequate training could and did get worse. In 1586, the infantry in Lancashire, Cheshire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire enrolled but did not train due to unseasonable weather. In the same counties that year, the cavalry did not train because they lacked cassocks and captains. The call for fit and abled men to fill the train band ranks was a sensible idea, but it was soon found that even short periods of training affected local economies badly. So badly that soon Lord Lieutenants were calling for the pressing of unemployable and masterless wanderers. It has been suggested that the train bands, and particularly the ones that were to go to the Netherlands and Ireland, were often the least desirable ones from society. The vagabonds, criminals, beggars, and the mentally unstable were picked to go abroad. Local authorities would take this impressment as an opportunity to rid communities of the dregs of society. It could almost be seen as a form of social cleansing. As we can quickly see here, the land forces, badly equipped, badly trained, badly motivated, held no real desire to be there or to serve their queen. Moreover, Elizabeth's nation was divided by religious dissent. Almost half were still Catholic, and fears of them rebelling in support of the Spanish haunted her government. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was appointed to command Elizabeth's armies in the south parts, to fight not only the invaders, but any rebels and traitors and other offenders and their adherents attempting anything against us, our crown and dignity, and to repress and subdue, slay or kill, and put to death by all ways and means any such insurgents for the conservation of our person and peace. Some among Elizabeth's subjects placed profit ahead of patriotism. In 1587, 12 English merchants, mostly from Bristol, were discovered supplying the Armada to the hurt of Her Majesty and the undoing of the realm if not redressed. 9 cargoes of contraband, valued between £300 and £2,000, were not just provisions, but also ammunition, gunpowder, muskets and ordnance. What's happened to these traitors is unknown, but in those edgy times they would have hardly enjoyed the Queen's mercy. Elsewhere, Sir John Gilbert, half-brother to Sir Walter Raleigh, refused permission for his ships to join Drake's Western Squadron, and allowed them to sail on their planned voyage in March 1588 in defiance of naval orders. Lacking time, money and resources, Elizabeth's government could only defend the most dangerous beaches by ramming wooden stakes into the sand as boat obstacles, or by digging deep trenches above the high water mark. Mud ramparts were thrown up to protect the few cannon available, or troops armed with arquebuses, an early type of musket, or bows and arrows. Fortifications on the strategically vital Isle of Wight were to be at least 4 feet high and 8 feet thick, with sharpened poles driven into their face and a wide ditch dug in front. But its governor, Sir George Carey, had just 4 guns and gunpowder enough for only 1 day's use. Portsmouth's freshly built ramparts protecting its land approaches had been severely criticised by Raleigh and were demolished, much to Elizabeth's chagrin. New earth walls were built in just 4 months, bolstered by 5 stone arrow-headed shaped bastions behind a flooded ditch. Yet more than half of Portsmouth's garrison were rated by age and impotency by no way serviceable, and the Earl of Sussex escaped unhurt when an old iron gun, supposedly one of his best cannon, blew up into smithereens. The network of warning beacons located throughout southern England since at least the early 14th century was overhauled. The iron fire baskets, mounted atop a tall wooden structure on earth mounds, were set around 15 miles apart. Kent and Devon had 43 beacon sites, and there were 24 each in Sussex and Hampshire. These were normally manned during the kinder weathers of March to October by 2 wise, vigilant and discreet men in 12-hour shifts. Surprise inspections ensured their diligence, and they were prohibited from having dogs with them for fear of distraction. Not everyone spent their time scanning the horizon for enemy ships. 2 watchers at Stanway Beacon in Essex preferred catching partridges in a cornfield and were hauled up in court. The census in 1588 revealed only 100 experienced martial men were available for military service, and as some had fought in Henry VIII's French and Scottish wars of 40 years before, these old sweats were considered hors de combat. Infantry and cavalry were drawn from the trained bands and county militia. 1,000 unpaid veterans from the English army in the Netherlands were hurriedly recalled, but they soon deserted to hide in the tenements of Kent's Cinque Ports. Militia officers were noblemen and gentry, whose motivation was not only defence of their country, but protection of their own property too. Many living near the coast believe it more prudent to move their households inland than stay and fight on the beaches, and were ordered to return on pain of Her Majesty's indignation, besides forfeiture of their lands and goods. Eventually, the main army was divided into 2 groups. The first, under Leicester, with 27,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry, would engage the enemy once he had landed in force. The second and larger formation, commanded by the Queen's cousin, Lord Hunsdon, totalled 28,000 infantry and 4,500 cavalry. Despite strenuous efforts to buy weapons in Germany and arquebuses from Holland, many militiamen were armed with only bows and arrows. Even worse, a large proportion was unarmed and untrained. To avoid the dangers of 5th columnist recusants in the militia ranks, every man had to swear an oath of loyalty to Elizabeth in front of their muster masters. Hardly the sign of a country united behind their queen. The diversity of men who joined the train bands is neatly summed up by this government report. So well sorted and chosen, both for able bodies and comely personages, that I assure your lordships yet doth exceed any county that I ever came in. In this county there were sour admissions that some trained bands were utterly untrained by any man of experience, or that apparently able men were incompetent, unruly, or had promptly absconded with their newly provided weapons. The captains that were training the trained bands also managed to disrupt the efficiency of the men under them. Sometimes captains reported they had a full muster when they had large gaps in the ranks. This meant they could pocket the difference when pay came through from local taxes. Captains, as discussed, should have been chosen due to their military experience, but all too often men of wealth or from notable families were chosen above them. Despite having limited or no military experience, captains were often elected, but due to local vendettas and false accusations, the training of trained band regiments were paralysed for months. The acquisition and training with weapons was also problematic for the trained bands. A year before the Armada, 1587, the harquebus and musket had only partially replaced the bill and the bow. The pike, sometimes up to 18 foot long, was still the preserve of the gentlemen of the bands, and was seen as a badge of social exclusivity. In 1586, only 4 to 5 men in each county were trained in the use of great artillery, and one report stated that no trained band, save the Isle of Wight, received a nominal allocation of ordnance from Whitehall. In 1587, with the threat of invasion growing, the allocation of ordnance to the bands was increased to certain vulnerable coasts. The coasts are not mentioned, nor the length of them, but the following guns were sent to each of them: 2 sakers, 2 minions, and 2 falcons. So why were the trained bands so badly equipped? It is simple. It is because funding did not come from the government. The upkeep fell on the local communities, which included muster wages, weapons, horses and feed. An average foot soldier would receive about 8 pence a day. The other costs, fortifications, ports, beaches and ancient towns and cities, were to be borne by those who benefited from their protection, not by the government that demanded their erection and maintenance. The devolution of this cost of war reduced the burden on the exchequer, but at the same time reduced the enthusiasm for the trained bands among the local populace. Needing to pay another tax encouraged an endemic culture of evasion that even a state of national crisis would not discourage. By the end of 1587, the bands could number at least 45,000 trained foot. These men were to follow a new policy of concentrating at likely landing places and not being dispersed from Wales to the Wash. This clearly brought complaints from Lord Lieutenants, who believed this new policy would leave their counties unprotected. The trained bands were not to seek a full battle with any invader, but wait until an English gross army could be gathered. The exalted person, Queen Elizabeth, who the trained bands and regular forces were tasked to protect, was causing troubles herself for local protection. With England lacking a large regular army, and with invasion threatening, it is amazing to think that in March 1588, Elizabeth had a personal guard of 28,000 infantry, 300 lancers, 2,000 light cavalry, and 36 artillery pieces. In July, this army was increased to 45,000 men. But the greatest scandal, and the smear that will forever blot Elizabeth's reign, is her treatment of her sailors. The men who may not have defeated the Spanish Armada, but their valiant sea battles deflected the Spanish and forced them into their fateful and fatal journey around Scotland and Ireland. She had invested in the navy, it is true, and she rewarded her successful privateers. Philip II would call them pirates. She had brilliant ship designers such as John Hawkins and Matthew Baker, who were both responsible for the new design of warship, the race-built galleon. Yet her patronage had limits, and her government's ability to supply the fleet, or lack of supply, is a damning indictment on good Queen Bess. The following letters from the fleet in hard-fought battles in the Channel are proof of the constant shortage of powder and shot experienced by Elizabeth's captains. The Tuesday following, about Portland, we had a sharp and long fight with them, wherein we spent a great part of our powder and shot, so as it was not thought good to deal with them any more till more was relieved. The Thursday following, by the occasion of the scattering of one of the great ships from the fleet, which we had hoped to cut off, there grew a hot fray, wherein some store of powder was spent, and after that little done until we came near to Calais. That morning being Monday, the 29th of July, we followed the Spaniards, and all that day had with them a long and great fight, wherein there was great valour showed generally by our company. In this battle there was spent very much of our powder and shot, and so the wind began to blow westerly, a fresh gale, and the Spanish put themselves somewhat to the northward, where we follow and keep company with them. Our ships, God be thanked, have received little hurt, and are of great force to accompany them, and of such advantage that with some continuance at the seas, and sufficiently provided of shot and powder, we shall be able, with God's favour, to weary them out of the sea and confound them. Now this fleet is here and very forcible, and must be waited upon with all our force, which is little enough. There should be an infinite quantity of powder and shot, provided and continually sent abroad, without the which great hazard may grow to our country. For this is the greatest and strongest combination to my understanding that ever was gathered in Christendom. Therefore I wish it of all hands to be mightily and diligently looked into and cared for. Our ships, God be thanked, receive little damage, and are well manned and of such advantage that while still continuing at sea, and sufficiently provided with shot and gunpowder, we shall be able, with God's favour, to surprise and defeat the Spanish. Sir, for the love of God and our country, let us have with some speed some shot sent to us of all sizes, for this will continue for a long time, and send some gunpowder with it. So as the running battles continued up the Channel, the English fleet was continually running out of desperately needed powder and shot. All these requests seemed to fall on deaf ears. An English gunner called William Thomas wrote to Lord Burleigh. They were fain at last to use plough chains instead of bullets. He went on to say that if the fleet had been properly supplied, it would have been the woefulest time for Spain. With the Spanish having been forced out of the Channel and up into the North Sea, when the fighting was all over, instead of celebrations and rewards for the English sailors, there was a chilling aftermath. Ships began turning about in the North Sea and returning to port. Charles Howard, the fleet commander, had arrived with his ships and starving crews at Harwich in Essex. Even still with the threat of Parma's army just across the Channel, the Queen refused to return to London, declaring that she would not think of deserting our army at a time of danger. The next day, her troops kept a public fast for victory. The rumours about Parma were just Elizabethan propaganda. With the cost of her forces in the likely invasion areas of Kent and Essex amounting to £783 a day, the Queen, despite making her famous Tilbury speech the day before, ordered an immediate demobilisation of the army. As more and more of the English ships returned, another problem was about to hit the Tudor court. These men, these brave men who had risked all, were now required to be paid. As soon as they left the ship, they would be due the money owed them. The Tudor state, realising the crippling costs the campaign had caused, kept the men on board in harbour. A weak excuse was that the Spanish were still in British waters, and ships were still needed in case of further Spanish attacks. But men kept in cramped conditions with poor supplies would soon succumb to infection and disease. And that's exactly what happened. Typhus, scurvy and dysentery swept through the crews, and many died of disease and starvation after landing at Margate. For instance, of the Elizabeth Bonaventure's crew of 500, more than 200 died, and the Elizabeth Jonas had just one living from the crew that it sailed with. Charles Howard wrote to Burleigh, "It would grieve any man's heart to see them that had served so valiantly die so miserably." The men had to rely on the charity of their officers, and Howard set an example by doing what he could out of his own purse to help the sailors. Nevertheless, upwards of 3,000 perished. As a result, the Chatham Chest was set up, its purpose to help pay pensions to disabled seamen. Howard continued to protest and wrote that despite the continued threat of the Spanish, the fleet needed a complete overhaul, resupply and time for the men to recover. He wrote, "The infection is grown very great. Those that come in fresh are soonest affected. They sicken one day and die the next." In the middle of September, John Hawkins wrote to Burleigh, "The companies do fall sick daily. It is not fit for me to persuade in so great a cause, but I see no reason to doubt the Spanish fleet, and our ships are utterly unfitted and unmeet to follow any enterprise from hence without a thorough new trimming, refreshing, and new furnishing with provisions, grounding, and fresh men." It was not until news was published about the Armada's disaster on the Irish coast that the ships began to be unmanned. But until then, men were kept in these disease-ridden ships. Men sickened and died in Harwich, Margate, Dover, and on the Downs. Even when the men were demobilised and allowed to leave the ships, there was nothing for them. No support, no money, no food, no clothes, and nowhere to stay. These emaciated, weak, and badly clothed men were dying in droves in the streets of Rochester and Dover. It is reported that out of the approximately 120 ships that left with the Spanish Armada, about half returned. But it is often forgot, or more likely deliberately not mentioned, that about half of the English fleet were dead from disease mere weeks after the Spanish had been chased up the North Sea. Howard continued to attempt to warn the court and the government about the sorry state of the fleet. He wrote, "The like infection will grow throughout the most of the fleet, for they have been so long at sea, and have little shift of apparel, and so few places to provide them of such wants, and no money wherewith to buy it, for some have been the most part of 8 months at sea." Yet Howard's protestations, and those of his captains such as Drake and Hawkins, were falling on deaf ears. Even his reports that stated all the ships were foul and unsavoury, and had so many weakly manned that they have not mariners to weigh their anchors. But the men at court and the Queen did not grieve. Burleigh, the Queen's chief advisor, showed true contempt and a callous heart for the men who had served their country so well. On hearing of the numbers of sailors dying, he said, "By death, by discharging of sick men, and such like, there may be spared something in the general pay." Howard raged about this indifference, and warned the Queen that if men should not be cared for better than to let them starve and die miserably, we should hardly get men to serve. But Howard was wasting his breath, for Elizabeth and her ministers were celebrating, partying too much to be worried about a little thing like common sailors dying. William Burrough, a naval captain, arrived at court to discuss the arrangements for discharging the fleet. Not only did he receive no instruction or guidance, but he was sent away in case perhaps he lowered the tone of the celebrations. Hawkins also showed concern for his men. The men have long been unpaid and need relief. Charles Howard was also so angry that his men had not received their wages. He was also disturbed by the condition of his men. The lack of fresh water caused another outbreak of disease. As they were still waiting for their wages to be paid, they were even unable to buy fresh food for themselves. Howard wrote bitterly, "It is a most pitiable sight to see. Here at Margate, how the men, having no place to receive them into here, die in the streets. I am driven myself, of force, to come aland, to see them bestowed in some lodging, and the best I can get is barns and outhouses." Vast numbers of seamen continued to die, chiefly of an infectious fever like typhus, aggravated by feeding on putrid beer or sour beer. Many of the sick were sent ashore at Margate. The Queen demurred to the expenses. Howard had already paid part of the cost of maintaining the fleet at Plymouth, sooner than break it up in accordance with the Queen's command, and his available means, which were not large considering his high rank, were exhausted. He wrote, "I will myself make satisfaction as well as I may, so that Her Majesty shall not be charged with it." Perhaps the best illustration of how little the Tudor state, and ultimately the Queen, cared for her fighting men is the fact that nearly £400,000 was spent on the defensive effort against the Spanish Armada, and against that the amount spent for caring for the injured and retired sailors, a mere £180. One of the most famous paintings of a monarch, and certainly of Elizabeth I, is the Armada portrait. It is a carefully constructed image of royalty and majesty. There are pearls pointing to the Queen's chastity. She has her hand on a globe, perhaps signifying she and England command the oceans, and very soon the Americas. More allegory can be seen by the fact there is a mermaid carved into her regal chair, suggesting again she rules the waves, or perhaps has the ability to lure sailors onto the rocks and to their doom. Exactly what happened to the Spanish on the Scottish and Irish coasts. But for me, it is the fact that she has her back turned to the sea. It illustrates her callousness and her indifference to the sea, and the sacrifice her sailors made in her name. The Spanish Armada will always be a heroic point in England's history, and the bravery and daring of the men in the fighting ships can never be questioned. But the actions of their Queen, before, during, and after the Armada, are for me a dark stain on her character which can never be erased.